May 1942, Rabaul Harbour, New Guinea. The air in the wardroom of the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN cruiser, Tenryu, is thick with the sweet smell of sake and the easy confidence of men who have dominated the Pacific for 6 months. A junior officer points derisively to an intercepted American intelligence report detailing the deployment of a new type of small, fast American craft. These boats, called patrol torpedo (PT) boats, are constructed primarily of mahogany plywood and manned by inexperienced young reservists. The room erupts in laughter. The IJN's war philosophy is built on the twin pillars of massive armor and overwhelming firepower. They field giant battleships like the Yamato and heavy cruisers armed with long-range 14-inch guns. In the eyes of the proud Japanese Naval Command, these tiny, flimsy American ships, barely 80 feet long, constructed of wood, and carrying just a handful of torpedoes, are an embarrassment to serious naval warfare. They are dismissed by the Japanese as gomikuzu, trash, and most commonly as toy ships or plywood killers. Their contempt is understandable. A standard IJN destroyer, the Yugumo class, displaces over 2,500 tons of steel. An 80-foot PT boat displaces just 56 tons of wood. The Americans themselves were initially skeptical. Built by small, specialized yards like Elko and Higgins, the PT boat project had been fraught with political infighting and design controversy. They were initially viewed as coastal defense craft, too small to impact the sprawling oceanic war in the Pacific. But the reality of these PT boats lies in their 3 critical attributes: speed, stealth, and a massive punch. Powered by 3 supercharged Packard V12 engines, a PT boat could hit speeds exceeding 40 knots, 46 miles per hour, faster than almost any major warship in the IJN. Their wooden hulls provided a natural, low radar signature compared to steel, making them ghosts in the night. And their armament, 4 massive 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, was the same size carried by large destroyers. A single successful hit from one of these torpedoes could shear off the bow or blow a hole the size of a bus in the side of any warship, regardless of its armor. The war in the Pacific would ultimately be decided not just in grand fleet engagements, but in the narrow, dark channels of the Solomon Islands, where the massive Imperial Navy would soon learn a terrifying lesson. A toy that carries a battleship-killing weapon is not a toy at all. The stage for this confrontation was already being set in the murky, contested waters around Guadalcanal, a perfect environment for the small, fast, and aggressively utilized American Mosquito fleet. The American Patrol Torpedo (PT) boat was a direct product of the urgent need for a fast, versatile offensive craft. The U.S. Navy initially struggled with design, seeking a vessel that could combine the endurance for long patrols with the speed to launch a surprise attack and escape. The ultimate solution came from specialized boat builders, primarily Elko and Higgins, who settled on a revolutionary and controversial material, plywood. The most prolific model, the 80-foot Elko boat, was constructed with a triple-planked mahogany hull. This choice wasn't about cost, it was about speed and stealth. Wood is significantly lighter than steel, allowing the boat to achieve its blistering 40-plus knot speeds. Furthermore, the wooden hull contributed to a reduced magnetic signature and, crucially for night fighting, a lower radar cross-section than comparable steel vessels, making them true ghosts of the sea to early war radar systems. The power came from a trio of engines, typically supercharged Packard 4M2 1,500 volts, 1-2 gasoline engines. These were enormous, highly tuned engines that could generate over 1,200 horsepower each. The downside was that they consumed massive amounts of high-octane aviation fuel, and being gasoline-powered, the PT boats were notoriously volatile. A single hit could turn the wooden hull into a fiery wreck, yet their main purpose was offense, and the armament was brutally effective. Initially, PT boats carried 4 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes mounted in roll-off racks, the same size weapon carried by destroyers. These torpedoes, though often unreliable in the early war, packed enough high explosive to sink any ship afloat. Later, PT boats were heavily modified in the field by their ingenious young crews, adding everything from 20mm Oerlikon cannon and 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns to heavy, 50-caliber machine guns in twin and quad mounts. This aggressive field modification reflected the nature of the PT crews themselves. The boats were often commanded by young, inexperienced naval reserve officers, many of whom were straight out of university. They lacked the rigid protocol of the larger navy but possessed an aggressive, improvisational spirit. They saw their small ships not as toys, but as instruments of personal revenge against the mighty, arrogant Imperial Navy. The Japanese Navy never took the PT boats seriously enough to develop a specific counter-tactic or armament, viewing them as a nuisance best handled by general-purpose anti-aircraft fire. This contempt, rooted in their belief that only large steel ships mattered, would prove to be a catastrophic blind spot, particularly when the war narrowed down to the deadly, claustrophobic sea lanes of the Solomon Islands. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, transformed the PT boat from a controversial experiment into an essential weapon. The entire struggle for the island hinged on controlling the narrow body of water separating the Solomon Islands, which American sailors quickly dubbed the Slot. This channel was the Imperial Japanese Navy's IJN lifeline, used nightly by their forces to rush troops and supplies to Guadalcanal, a nocturnal operation the Americans grimly called the Tokyo Express. The IJN's heavy warships, cruisers and destroyers were highly effective at shelling American positions on Guadalcanal during the night, and then retreating before dawn brought American air power. American surface fleets struggled to intercept the Express because the Japanese were masters of night fighting. However, the Slot, with its unpredictable currents, numerous small islands, and dense coastal shadows, was the perfect environment for the PT boats. The PT base was established at Tulagi, a small island just north of Guadalcanal. From there, the PT boats could patrol the darkness, acting as a flexible, high-speed tripwire. Their mission was not necessarily to sink the large Japanese warships directly, but to harass, report, and slow the Tokyo Express. They were the eyes and ears of the American Navy in the darkness, often acting as the only early warning system for incoming surface fleets. The PT crews, often spending nights on the rough seas under a constant threat of ambush, developed a terrifying competence. They learned to use the mahogany hull's low radar signature to their advantage, slipping silently through the shadows and waiting for their prey. Their primary foes were initially the Japanese destroyers, which the PT boats encountered on banzai runs, carrying personnel and supplies. The battles were brutal, close-range affairs where the Japanese destroyer captains would pour machine gun and cannon fire onto the tiny, wooden targets, while the PT boats would weave desperately, trying to launch their devastating Mark 8 torpedoes. These early clashes were costly for the Mosquito fleet. The Japanese realized that if they could manage to hit a PT boat, its gasoline fuel and wooden construction turned it into an instant pyre. Yet, the Japanese contempt persisted. They believed the tiny craft were merely an annoyance. They failed to grasp that by forcing the Japanese destroyers to alter course, drop speed, or waste time fighting, the PT boats successfully disrupted the precise timing of the Tokyo Express. This continuous, nocturnal interference set the stage for the crucial, large-scale naval engagements that followed, particularly the pivotal, chaotic battle that would deliver the most powerful target imaginable directly into the PT boats' sights. The night of November 12 to 13, 1942, was chaos personified. A close-range brawl that earned the water northwest of Guadalcanal the moniker Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese, determined to crush the American beachhead at Henderson Field, launched a massive surface bombardment force led by Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. Crucially, Abe's force included two powerful fast battleships, the Kirishima and the massive battlecruiser Hiei, equipped with devastating 14-inch guns. These were the pride of the Imperial Navy, armored mountains of steel meant to flatten American positions with impunity. The resulting clash, the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, was fought at point-blank range, a terrifying, confusing melee of searchlights, torpedo wakes, and roaring artillery. American destroyers and cruisers, under Admiral Daniel Callahan, charged directly into the Japanese formation, turning the battle into a desperate, confused, slugging match. In the darkness, the massive Japanese flagship, Hiei, became a bewildered giant. She was designed to destroy American cruisers from a distance, not survive a street fight with them. Crucially, Hiei was blinded by American illumination and damaged severely by a barrage of close-range 5-inch shells from American destroyers and the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco. The cruiser's gunnery crews poured round after round into Hiei's superstructure at a distance of only a few thousand yards. The sustained beating tore into Hiei's vital control systems. Her steering was severely damaged, and her captain was killed. She veered wildly, eventually finding herself unable to maintain course, dead in the water, or slowly circling uncontrollably. As dawn broke on November 13th, the carnage was clear. The American Navy had suffered grievous losses, 2 admirals killed, several ships sunk, but the Japanese bombardment force had been repulsed. And there, steaming slowly or drifting aimlessly near Savo Island, was the prize, the 36,000-ton behemoth, the battlecruiser IJN Hiei. Admiral William Bull Halsey, far to the south, received the reports. Hiei was crippled, unable to escape the vicinity of Guadalcanal. She was too slow, too damaged, and now, with the rising sun, she was vulnerable to the American air power based at Henderson Field. Halsey issued the unambiguous command, Hiei must be sunk. Repeated air attacks from Marine and Navy dive bombers were launched throughout the day, pounding the stationary giant. But as dusk approached, Hiei, though battered, remained afloat. To ensure she did not escape under the cover of the next night's darkness, Halsey made a decision that would summon the tiny ships of the Mosquito Fleet to face the largest target they had ever seen. The job now fell to the desperate, tenacious PT crews operating out of Tulagi. They were ordered to go out into the night and strike the crippled battleship, keeping her crew awake, preventing any escape or salvage attempt, and, if possible, finishing the job. The tiny, wooden toy ships were about to engage a wounded giant of the sea. Type continue to generate the next section. The exact date is debated among intelligence historians, but the event is crystal clear. A U.S. Air Force North American F-86E Sabre, damaged in combat over Mig Alley, ran out of fuel while attempting to return to base and was forced to ditch. The pilot, whose identity remains officially obscured in Soviet records, performed a skillful emergency landing. The jet skimmed across the shallow water and soft silt of the tidal area, coming to rest relatively intact, though submerged enough to discourage immediate American recovery. The pilot was successfully rescued by American forces, but in the haste and amid the constant threat of enemy patrols, the specific location of the valuable jet was misidentified or deemed too risky for an immediate, full-scale salvage operation. The American forces relied on the fact that the F-86 had ditched in a contested zone, assuming it would be destroyed by the elements or enemy action before it could be studied. But Soviet intelligence, likely aided by local North Korean observers who had been alerted to the ongoing Bluebird program, quickly pinpointed the wreck. The jet had settled into the soft, oxygen-starved mud, which, paradoxically, offered a measure of preservation against corrosion. The urgency was paramount. The Americans would inevitably launch a mission to bomb the wreck into oblivion once daylight returned. Under the deepest secrecy and operating exclusively at night, Soviet and Chinese military personnel, along with naval recovery specialists, launched a complex, grueling salvage operation. Working in the difficult terrain of the mudflats, they used pontoons and makeshift lifting equipment. Every effort was made to extract the jet without causing further structural damage. The greatest prize was the Westinghouse J-47GE-17 engine, and most importantly, the entire wing and tail assembly. Finally, under the cloak of a massive logistical operation, the captured F-86 was disassembled into transportable sections. The pieces were wrapped, heavily crated, and given the highest priority clearance. They were moved inland through Chinese territory via rail, a logistical operation that itself required silencing entire railway lines and diverting scheduled military transport. From China, The disassembled parts of the American fighter were loaded onto Soviet ships. Their ultimate destination, the most secret airbase in the Soviet Union, the Flight Test and Research Institute, LII, at Zhukovsky, near Moscow. The Soviets had succeeded where they had failed with every previous attempt. They had in their possession an almost complete, high-performance American jet fighter. The analysis of this single aircraft would provide the Soviet Union with a 5-year leap in aerodynamic and fire control technology, profoundly impacting the next generation of Soviet fighter jets. They were about to learn, in the most painful detail, exactly where the MiG-15 was lacking and why the F-86 often held the combat advantage. The orders radioed to the PT boat squadron at Tulagi were met with a mixture of dread and fierce excitement. Their target was not a Tokyo Express supply run. It was a behemoth, the battlecruiser Hiei, a vessel nearly 700 feet long, covered in thick steel armor and bristling with powerful secondary armament. This was a mismatch of epic proportions. As the late evening of November 13th settled, 3 PT boats, PT 107, commanded by Lieutenant Yar Lester E. Gamble, PT 124, led by Lieutenant Yeg C.R. Smith, and PT 123, commanded by Lieutenant Yeg F.T. Chamberlain, slipped out of Tulagi Harbour and into the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound. Their mission was to find the crippled battleship and keep the pressure on. The search was tense. Hiei, though damaged, was still flanked by several destroyers acting as her bodyguards, and the darkness concealed the movements of all ships. PT 107, moving at high speed, was the first to make contact, catching sight of the battleship's towering, dark silhouette against the moonless sky. Lieutenant Gamble knew that the Japanese crew would be on edge, their guns scanning the water, waiting for the inevitable follow-up attack. Gamble ordered the engines pushed to maximum speed. The PT boat's 3 massive Packard engines screamed, pushing the mahogany hull through the water at over 40 knots. This blinding speed was their only defense. They approached from an angle that offered the least visibility, hoping to get inside the Japanese destroyer screen before they were detected. The attack run began under a hail of fire. The Japanese destroyers and the Hiei's own secondary guns erupted, painting the darkness with tracers. The heavy-caliber Japanese shells, designed to obliterate much larger ships, screamed past the tiny wooden hull. The PT crew was completely exposed, hugging the deck, while the 50-caliber machine guns on their boat furiously returned fire, a heroic but futile gesture against the battleship's steel bulk. Despite the punishing fire, Lieutenant Gamble held course long enough to launch the full spread of 4 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes. The launch was made in the face of certain death. After releasing the torpedoes, PT 107 executed a violent, high-speed turn, laying down a smokescreen and utilizing its speed to escape the immediate zone of impact. The crew watched anxiously. They saw the faint, telltale splash of the torpedoes hitting the water, followed by the straight white wake tracking toward the monstrous target. Did they hit? The chaos of the night made immediate confirmation impossible, but the audacious attack achieved its primary goal. It shook the nerves of the Japanese crew, reinforced their fear of the unseen enemy, and, crucially, wasted precious hours and fuel the Hiei needed for damage control or escape. The toy ships had just brazenly fired the largest conventional weapons in the American arsenal directly at the pride of the Imperial Navy. The night's work was just beginning. Whether PT 107's initial torpedoes found their mark is disputed. Some reports indicate a possible hit, while official records often prioritize the air attacks. But what is certain is that the audacious night attack achieved its psychological purpose. It signaled to the crippled crew of the Hiei and her escorting destroyers that there would be no rest, no repair, and no escape under the cover of darkness. The Japanese sailors on Hiei were already exhausted and demoralized, having survived a close-range battle that had killed their captain and rendered their ship nearly immobile. Now, they faced the constant, terrifying threat of the Mosquito fleet. The PT boats didn't stop with the initial attack. They returned throughout the night in waves, using their high speed and small size to weave through the destroyer screen. Other PT boat crews, guided by the flickering chaos of distant gunfire and flares, located the battleship. PT-37 and PT-39, operating nearby, joined the fray. They were not attempting grand surface engagements. They were engaging in guerrilla warfare on the high seas. The tactics were crude but effective. Approach at top speed, fire a torpedo or two, and immediately break off before the Japanese guns could lock on. The speed of the PT boats often meant that by the time the massive main and secondary batteries of Hiei could depress low enough and track fast enough, the small wooden craft were already outside the danger zone. The Japanese response was a desperate deluge of tracer fire. They were using every available weapon from light machine guns to 5-inch dual-purpose guns to try and vaporize the fast-moving targets. The air above the water was a spiderweb of red and green tracers, but hitting a plywood hull traveling at 40 knots in the darkness proved nearly impossible for the heavy, slow-to-train Japanese guns. While it is difficult to confirm hits from every attack, the effect of the harassment was massive. The constant threat of torpedoes prevented the Japanese from effectively carrying out damage control. Every time a PT boat was sighted or suspected, the Hiei and her destroyers had to turn on searchlights and unleash torrents of fire, revealing their own positions and forcing the crew to abandon repair efforts. The psychological toll of the unrelenting, unseen enemy was immense. The tiny PT boats, operating independently and using the very darkness that protected the massive Hiei to their advantage, succeeded in preventing any attempt to tow the crippled ship to safety or stabilize her enough for a high-speed withdrawal. By the time the relentless patrols of the Mosquito fleet retired to Tulagi, as dawn approached on November 14th, the fate of the great battle cruiser was sealed. The toy ships had done their job with a tenacity that the Imperial Navy had never imagined possible. When the tropical sun rose high over Guadalcanal on November 14th, 1942, the sheer size of the crippled warship standing sentinel near Savo Island was revealed. Hiei was a wreck. Her superstructure was riddled with holes from the close-range barrage, her bow was down, and her vital steering and engine compartments were failing. Though still afloat, she was slow, unmaneuverable, and critically exposed. Admiral Halsey's previous orders were renewed with ferocity. Sink her. Throughout the morning, wave after wave of American aircraft, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes from Henderson Field, and the carrier USS Enterprise pounded the immobile giant. The combined effect of the previous night's surface engagement and the daylight air attacks was relentless. But the success of the airstrikes was made possible by the exhaustion and vulnerability created by the tiny ships of the Mosquito fleet. The relentless harassment by PT-107 and the other boats had successfully disrupted the entire Japanese damage control effort throughout the night. Every time the engineers tried to patch the worst holes or stabilize the steering, the threat of another torpedo run forced them to abandon their stations and prepare for action. The Japanese crews were sleepless, demoralized, and their ship was leaking badly. The Japanese command, realizing that the great battle cruiser could neither be saved nor towed to safety, made the grim, final decision. Vice Admiral Abe ordered the ship abandoned and scuttled. To prevent the pride of the IJN from falling into American hands, the surviving crew opened her seacocks, deliberately flooding the engine rooms and magazines. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a vessel built for thunderous glory. As the crew were evacuated by the escorting destroyers, the massive bulk of Hiei began to settle heavily into the water. The enormous battleship, the first of her kind to be lost by Japan in World War II, slipped beneath the waves of Iron Bottom Sound. The sinking of the Hiei was a massive psychological and strategic victory for the Allies. It was a victory achieved not by one overwhelming force, but by a perfect chain of combined action. American cruisers and destroyers inflicted the initial damage, Marine and Navy planes prevented daylight escape, and the PT boats, the toy ships, provided the sustained, psychological terror that prevented recovery and sealed her fate. They proved that speed and a massive weapon, wielded with courage in the darkness, could paralyze even the largest ship in the world. The Japanese contempt for the wooden, gasoline-powered boats evaporated instantly, replaced by a grudging fear of the tenacious Mosquito fleet. Type continue to generate the next section. The exact date is debated among intelligence historians, but the event is crystal clear. A U.S. Air Force North American F-86E Sabre, damaged in combat over Mig Alley, ran out of fuel while attempting to return to base and was forced to ditch. The pilot, whose identity remains officially obscured in Soviet records, performed a skillful emergency landing. The jet skimmed across the shallow water and soft silt of the tidal area, coming to rest relatively intact, though submerged enough to discourage immediate American recovery. The pilot was successfully rescued by American forces, but in the haste and amid the constant threat of enemy patrols, the specific location of the valuable jet was misidentified or deemed too risky for an immediate, full-scale salvage operation. The American forces relied on the fact that the F-86 had ditched in a contested zone, assuming it would be destroyed by the elements or enemy action before it could be studied. But Soviet intelligence, likely aided by local North Korean observers who had been alerted to the ongoing Bluebird program, quickly pinpointed the wreck. The jet had settled into the soft, oxygen-starved mud, which, paradoxically, offered a measure of preservation against corrosion. The urgency was paramount. The Americans would inevitably launch a mission to bomb the wreck into oblivion once daylight returned. Under the deepest secrecy and operating exclusively at night, Soviet and Chinese military personnel, along with naval recovery specialists, launched a complex, grueling salvage operation. Working in the difficult terrain of the mudflats, they used pontoons and makeshift lifting equipment. Every effort was made to extract the jet without causing further structural damage. The greatest prize was the Westinghouse J-47GE-17 engine, and most importantly, the entire wing and tail assembly. Finally, under the cloak of a massive logistical operation, the captured F-86 was disassembled into transportable sections. The pieces were wrapped, heavily crated, and given the highest priority clearance. They were moved inland through Chinese territory via rail, a logistical operation that itself required silencing entire railway lines and diverting scheduled military transport. From China, the disassembled parts of the American fighter were loaded onto Soviet ships. Their ultimate destination, the most secret airbase in the Soviet Union, the Flight Test and Research Institute, LII, at Zhukovsky, near Moscow. The Soviets had succeeded where they had failed with every previous attempt. They had in their possession an almost complete, high-performance American jet fighter. The analysis of this single aircraft would provide the Soviet Union with a 5-year leap in aerodynamic and fire control technology, profoundly impacting the next generation of Soviet fighter jets. They were about to learn, in the most painful detail, exactly where the MiG-15 was lacking and why the F-86 often held the combat advantage. The sinking of the Hiei marked a permanent shift in how the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed the small, fast surface craft of the United States. The toy ships were no longer dismissed as mere nuisances. They were recognized as legitimate, deadly threats that could cripple capital ships when employed aggressively in a suitable environment. The fear they instilled was the fear of the unseen, the terror of the unpredictable, fast attack in the darkness. This respect was hard-earned. The PT boats continued to patrol the confined waters of the Solomons and beyond throughout the war, participating in countless actions. While their success rate in sinking large, undamaged warships was statistically low, their value lay in their disruptive capability. A PT boat on patrol meant a Japanese convoy had to increase vigilance, reduce speed, and risk breaking radio silence, all actions that made them more vulnerable to subsequent air and submarine attack. The PT boat's contribution was one of versatility. They performed an astonishing array of missions, from scouting and rescue operations to inserting commando units deep behind enemy lines. They successfully adapted their firepower, ripping out the roll-off torpedo racks for more reliable, aircraft-derived torpedo tubes, and adding field-modified rocket launchers and heavier anti-aircraft guns. These small, versatile craft evolved from simple torpedo launchers into powerful, mobile gunboats, ready to engage barges, destroyers, and shore batteries. The most famous PT boat of all, PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, tragically met the fate the Japanese often sought. It was cut in half by the larger, steel Japanese destroyer Amagiri. The sinking underscored the immense danger inherent in the PT boat's high-speed close-quarters combat. Yet, the legendary resilience and resourcefulness of its crew also reinforced the PT boat's enduring mythos. Ultimately, the story of the American PT boats is not just about wood and gasoline, it is about the audacity of small, fast, and light design, triumphing over the reliance on massive armor and conventional warfare doctrine. They proved that, in the narrow, contested seas of the Pacific, the most technologically advanced weapons were not always the biggest. They were the ones that maximized a decisive advantage in this case, speed and stealth, and were wielded by crews possessing the tenacity to face down a giant. The Mosquito fleet earned its place in history, forever silencing the contempt of an enemy who had learned, in the most painful way, that a toy ship carrying a full-sized torpedo is the deadliest kind of surprise.